Welcome in Mu.ZEE, Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Ostend. My name is Mieke. I work as a curator in this museum and I would like to show you around. We're going to focus today on James Ensor. We have a beautiful collection of works, documents, drawings, paintings, etching in the collection by James Ensor, and I want to show you some of these excellent works. James Ensor was born in a very small city called Ostend. He lived very close to the seaside. There was a fisher community, a very small town. Growing up, he saw the city changing as well to a very modern and fashionable seaside resort, so to speak. And that is also something that you can see in his work. When Ensor was like 16 years old, he already knew he wanted to become an artist. He drew a lot, he painted on whatever he could find, cardboards, pieces of paper, pieces of wood. He took them with him in nature and just spent hours painting dunes, landscapes, the fisher community. This is a little cafe outside of the city of Ostend that he painted. He spent a lot of time outside, was a big fan of plenarism. He was not educated at that point in painting. He had some old Ostend masters that he could take some lessons from, but in the end he decided to go to Brussels and go to the academy. And so he spent almost 3 years there in Brussels studying painting, drawing, modeling, all the classic academic ways of growing as an artist. But after that short period, he decided that that was not his style of painting, of working as an artist, and he decided to follow his own imagination. So when he returned to Ostend, he had an atelier on the top floor of his parents' house, from where he could really observe the street and see the people walking, talking. He was constantly entertained by whatever passed by through his window, and that is visible in multiple drawings and paintings, of course. Here you see how he uses the bird's eye view from his window, looking down to the street, seeing people walking. This is a snowy landscape from the Van Isegamlaan, one of the bigger streets in Ostend. It's very sketchy made. He uses a lot of different techniques, not only paintbrush, but also palette knife. And you see how he really, in a very modern way, tries to create this, in his eye, realistic scenery of what he discovers from his window. As I told earlier, James Ensor was really a big fan of going into nature and paint directly from nature. What interests him was not the genre of the marine as such, but really more the way that he could capture the constant changing of light and colors in the sky, and how he could capture that with his painting, with his techniques and the colors. He could really play with that. And here you see a very early example when he was just back from his short period in Brussels, and you see it's a scenery after the storm, it's called. Early in the morning, you see a slight piece of a rainbow appearing after the storm set, and it's an explosion of colors. And you see how he really is finding his way to play with that more than trying to make a realistic imagery. A bit later, in this larger marine, he's going even further in trying to find a way to capture light, which is phenomenal in Ostend, and it changes every day, and that's what fascinates him. And here you see the sun setting. It's the last moment, and he captures it in full. You see all these pink and yellow and blue colors coming together in that sky, and he was really very good at doing that. This is a portrait of Willy Finch. He's a fellow artist of James Ensor, and after they returned from the academy in Brussels, they both shared an atelier in Ostend. They drew the same figures, made the same kind of settings for painting still lifes. They, of course, painted each other's portrait quite often, and this is an example of it. Although it's very dark, and you see him sitting very static in his chair, very dark colors. But what attracts my attention is this detail. This I assume it's a window, but for me that's the essence of the whole painting. That you see this square in the back where he just goes loose with colors and tries to capture the light again with a lot of pink and blue and grey and all that. And for me it's nice and attracts my attention because it looks it's like a very modernist abstract detail. What you see is a picture of James Ensor in front of the souvenir shop run by his mother, Marie Hackman. She sold shells, flowers, vases, and of course a lot of masks in her shop. It of course influenced him in his work, because a lot of these elements that she sold in her shop gradually infiltrated in his work. I showed you already some examples of early seascapes that James Ensor made. This is an example of a little later. He created this Christ calming the storm. So it's not only a seascape, it's also a genre painting. It's a biblical scene from the New Testament. So this is a very nice example of how he develops his seascapes from very realistic to an explosion full of drama and atmosphere. Color and light becomes something, a tool he uses to create something else. He goes beyond just painting reality. He really changes his palette enormously and chooses more and more these bright colors. This is really a nice dramatic example of how he's changing in his work. I'm standing here in front of a work that's called Mask and Death. It's a very typical example of how Ensor used a lot of masks and kind of weird things that his mother sold in her shop. He was frustrated that people didn't believe in what he did as an artist, and that's a big motive for him to start using masks in his work. And he started to use these masks and skeletons really to say something about this frustration and really use them to mock society and to show this content of the situation he was put in. What is interesting about this work is that it was used later on. The image was used on the banknotes, the Belgian banknotes before the euro came in. The 100 franc note, this particular scene was used. We are in front of James Ensor's self-portrait with flowered head. It's a fantastic piece of art, quite the star of our collection, I think. There's a lot to say about this work, and maybe I can start with saying that it didn't used to look like it looks now. He painted his self-portraits quite often as a very young artist, and he kept doing it his entire life, creating self-portraits. But this was a very typical self-portrait. He created around 83, something like that. Very dark colors, very realistic style he used. It was only later that he decided to make some changes and add this flower head. He gave these little blue curls an extra touch to the mustache, so accents here and there, and very important as well is he created some kind of mirroring effect. It's not any longer a portrait that you as a viewer can look at. It becomes an artist who is looking in the mirror, just looking at himself, and we are like locked out from the image. And that is very interesting to realize. So when we say that James Ensor reworked his self-portraits, This is something that only was cleared out later on in the 60s. People started investigating also with other kind of techniques, photographing in different ways to see layers behind layers and really investigate works in a different way. And this is what also happened here. When you really start looking at the different ways of using light and the colors, you see that this is all from this really dark, realistic period of the early 80s in the 19th century, and then you see this bright color palette appearing in the head, which is completely different. And he really uses other kinds of paint, other kinds of colors and techniques as well. And you see that in how he created the head and the details on top of it, how thin they are. So he really created a nice travestite portrait, actually, of himself. I just showed you Ensor's self-portrait with a flowered head. Now I want to show you a completely different self-portrait. He etched this very small self-portrait in the same year that he added the flowered head in the painting. In this portrait, he shows how he uses humor to deal with the situation he's in, and that is a constant thing in his whole oeuvre. How he uses humor to really talk about also frustrating things that happen. So humor is never far away, and so here you see a self-portrait, how he's lying as a skeleton. My self-portrait in 1960, he calls it. Talking about self-portraits, here you see an affiche for an exhibition that he held in Paris. It was his first international exhibition, Salon des Cent, and here you see himself surrounded by demons and devils and all kinds of strange and scary creatures, talking about humor and self-mockery. This is also a very nice example, I think. So this painting is called The Gendarmes. So what Ensor did here is addressing social injustice in Ostend, the city where he lived, and he depicts the repression of the fisher community by the police. And this is what we see here. We see two fishermen that actually happened in that specific event in 1887. Two fishermen died, others were wounded, and here we see a view in the morgue. Two dead fishermen guarded by the gendarme. There's a nun praying. The people, the fishermen community, are left outside, quite harshly repressed still in this painting. Judges watching all over the whole scenery. It's Ensor really mocking the situation and talking about how injustice the situation was, and he felt really engaged in this injustice situation for the fishermen. So he was always interested in politics and how that affected his city and the situation he lived in. And maybe one of the biggest examples I can present to you is, it's not the real one, but it's a carpet version of Christ entering Brussels in 1889. When James Ensor painted Christ entering Brussels, he was nearly 30 years old. He was very active in the artistic world, not always appreciated. He had a rough moment in his life. His father died. A lot of things were happening personally, but also socially. Political changes that influenced him in creating his masterpiece, we can say. So the main subject of this painting is Christ entering Brussels. So what he did is taking an old biblical theme and places into a very modern context, and he places it in Brussels. But it's actually just a starting for creating something completely different, because you although Christ is in the middle of the work, your attention is not drawn to him at all. Your attention is really scattered as you see the figures crowding the whole canvas and cannot really tell where to focus first. You have multiple perspectives he uses, and the colors he uses to create this work isn't really helping to get focus on one or the other. What is fascinating is this explosion of masks, a theme that he often uses to mock, to create a satire of situations. He uses this work also in a very pamphletarian way. Vive Jésus, roi de Bruxelles, vive la sociale, fanfare doctrinaire. He's really using this scenery in a political way as well. It's nice to add that how he identifies himself with Jesus, and so in that sense, nobody is really caring what he's doing at all. It was painted in 1888. When he finished the painting, it was excluded from the salon of that year, so he was very frustrated about it because nobody could really see what he had achieved. More than 30 years he kept it in his atelier until 1929, when he had a very large retrospective in Brussels. A big appreciation nationally but also internationally for his work, not only for this painting but for his entire oeuvre. The huge success of the exhibition he had in Brussels in 1929 made him decide to create a tapestry version of this masterpiece, and so he started with some help. Of course, he was getting old, but he was coloring it himself, and it's only afterwards in 2008 that we could finally make this tapestry version of it, which we can show now to the audience in Ostend. I hope you enjoyed this little tour in Mu.ZEE. This wing is ready, freshly reinstalled for you to come and visit. Unfortunately, we cannot open for you yet. We hope that this will change soon and that we can welcome you here in Ostend in Mu.ZEE.